Hi, I'm Anjali Alapat, the host of Arcs, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In season 4, I'm going to be talking to some wonderful South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. Today, for the first time ever, this podcast features multiple guests. The people behind the incredibly successful anthology, The Blaft Book of Anti-Caste SF. Rashmi Devadasan, Rakesh Khanna, and R.T. Samuel. Rashmi is one of the co-founders of Blaft Publications and a writer with over 25 years of experience in indie publishing, Tamil feature films, and Indian English theatre. She's the author of Kumari Loves a Monster, and her short stories have featured in anthologies like Strange Worlds, Strange Times, Amazing Sci-Fi Stories. Rakesh grew up in Berkeley, California, and co-founded Blaft Publications in 2008. Rakesh is the co-author of Ghosts, Monsters, and Demons of India, the editor of Blaft's Tamil pulp fiction and Gujarati pulp fiction anthologies, and the co-editor of the Blaft Book of Anti-Caste SF. R.T. Samuel is an editor and independent cultural producer working between London and New Delhi. R co-edited the Blaft Book of Anti-Caste SF, and between 2021 and 2023, R also wrote and produced the hugely popular underground political and cultural education podcast, Clear Blue Skies, Experiencing Ambedkar. Join us for a great conversation about what goes into creating an expansive anthology, the importance of varied anti-caste perspectives, what's missing in the Indian science fiction scene, Enid Blyton, and more. Hi Rakesh, Rashmi and R. Welcome to Arcs. Thank you so much for being here today. So first off, congratulations on the Blaft Book of Anti-Caste SF, which is a wonderful anthology that all our listeners should go out and buy right now. Congratulations and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Anjali.
Thanks so much, Anjali. Looking forward to this.
Thank you.
I have been dying to talk to you guys ever since I heard about this book, and I'm really excited that I'm getting the chance to. So to kickstart this whole conversation, I'm always really excited to ask this question, and it's the first thing I throw out there. What made you want to be a writer and a storyteller? Did you always want to be one? And how did this all happen for you?
I guess I can start because I think mine's shorter, but I just was always a huge bookworm growing up. And you naturally think about writing. I did originally want to be an author, but then I quickly realized that I enjoyed reading more. It really used to really infuriate my mother because she was like, why don't you review books? Why don't you write something? Why don't you write something? And I just wanted to read. And she was always like, you can't read so much without having anything to say about it. And so now she feels really successful. Now she's like, well, I told you so. I was always really interested in how books were made and just found that whole process magical. When you just love something so much that you want to be involved in it.
Yeah, I don't know if I really call myself a storyteller or a writer, or I've written some stuff, but not so much fiction. I've always loved anthologies. I grew up reading a lot of science fiction collections and anthologies of short stories. And I always liked the idea of putting things together. That was always exciting to me.
Rashmi, do you want to throw in your origin story?
I grew up where the only books available for kids were a lot of Enid Blytons. I mean, of course, it's hugely problematic, but I think the whole import of those books and what they represent is something that I'm processing now. But that was what brought me to reading. Grew up with only comics like Archie's and Tintin and Tinkle or ACK, and then suddenly you had a whole slew of different genres and writings and graphic novels. For the first time, you're introduced to Joe Sacco and all these other kind of writers. And I think in college, I discovered that I also like a lot of horror. And I hadn't really ventured into too much science fiction or speculative fiction. I think once we started publishing Kuili, and I had never encountered anything like her work. And that really got me interested. This is the kind of writing that can exist and that is so different from anything that I grew up with or was used to reading.
Thank you for mentioning Enid Blyton, because I feel like as problematic as Enid Blyton is, it was kind of the gateway drug for a lot of us.
Absolutely. Especially as an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old when you're starting to read. I mean, you can't compare that to what's available for kids today. But I think as somebody who's starting out to read as a child 30, 35 years ago, that was all that was available in English.
Absolutely. And I think now they've sanitized those books and made them very PC. But
well, they were pretty fascist. There's a lot of straight up Nazi sympathizer stuff in those books. They're kind of horrifying. And then a couple generations later, you have J.K. Rowling. So there's all these very right-leaning British children's authors indoctrinating the world's children. It's dangerous.
If we start talking about J.K. Rowling, we'll be here all night. That kind of makes me interested in learning about what your relationship with sci-fi and speculative fiction is like, because Rashmi mentioned that she came to it later. But what about you, Rakesh? What about you, R?
I grew up in California, so it was very different. Everything was available, and we had dedicated science fiction and fantasy bookstores. So I was exposed to all, by and large, white writers and mostly white male writers like Asimov and the Hugo winners from the golden age of science fiction and all that stuff. And it wasn't till later, like college, that I started reading people from different places and different backgrounds. And of course, there's been this incredible movement over the last couple of decades where science fiction has become greatly diversified. And there's all kinds of projects and all kinds of authors who are bringing really new perspectives to the whole thing. So yeah, I just always wanted to be part of that.
I started out reading a lot of fantasy. So if you say science fiction and fantasy, like SFF, I was very much on the S side more. Definitely started with a Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, like all the kind of children's fantasy. Philip Pullman, Philip Reeve. Because we had a membership to the British Council Library. I'm going to just say right now, my mom is going to feature a lot in this interview because she really is instrumental in developing my taste for reading in that sense. I think both of us don't really read a lot of contemporary literature. So the children's equivalent of that would be Jacqueline Wilson and Kathy Cassidy and a lot of books about teenagers who are living normal lives. So you just read so much of stuff with magic and people having adventures and shape shifting. And I think the line between science fiction and fantasy is really thin in kids lit. So it just grew from there. I did definitely try to get into more classic SF as I got older, but I was only really able to stomach the fantasy. So Shannara and Wheel of Time, that kind of stuff. I just could never really get into classic science fiction. And then, like Rakesh was saying, around that time, there was so much newer and more selective science fiction, like science fiction authors that were speaking back to the canon. So I could just jump straight into those. And then I just went from there.
I'm almost jealous that you didn't have to wade through the reams of terrible science fiction, I do feel like growing up, I read a lot of old white guys writing sci-fi, and the shift was so monumental and awesome. And I do very much think of this anthology as part of that shift, and very excited to talk to you guys about it. And before we dive into it, could you tell us a bit about your background and how you came to be working on this anthology, just in terms of your careers?
I was working as a journalist in Delhi and really hating it. My background was in culture journalism, and then I shifted to more regular beat reporting, and it was really getting me down. And I had been interested in working in publishing before, so I'd done a few internships. So I wanted to switch and applied to a bunch of places, and Blaft was the only place that responded. But then when Rakesh got back to me, I was applying for an internship. And he was like, "You're way too overqualified for an intern." And I was like, "I would do anything, please get me out of this." But then we just were trying to figure out what I could do, what kind of project. And I was initially thinking, because I had this podcast that was pretty well known called Clear Blue Skies Experiencing Ambedkar, which is a kind of political theory, interview based, very high production sort of podcast. Maybe I could do some kind of audio project or a Blaft podcast or that kind of thing. But Rakesh and I, we had so many similar favorite authors, and also just this kind of frustration with how amazing science fiction and speculative fiction had become internationally, but how lacking it was in the Indian publishing market. So I think it was a lot of just first fanboying and then complaining and then, okay, let's do something. And it was a pretty natural transition, at least from my end.
I still can't believe this all started out as an internship opportunity. That's amazing.
Yeah, when Rashmi and I started Blaft, part of it was just in response to being really annoyed and bored with what we saw available in the Indian writing in English section, or Indian writing in English, whether it was written in English or whether it was translated to English. And this is back in the aughts. It just seemed like everything was very exotified, and there was always a sari border and a mango, and it's about some sad housewife. Or if it was translated stuff, a lot of that fiction was amazing, but it's very realist. And we were into science fiction and fantasy and comics, and we wanted to see different kinds of things. And we knew that it was happening. It wasn't that there weren't writers like that in India, right? It's just that it wasn't making it into the bookstore somehow. It was happening in local languages, like Tamil has this crazy pulp fiction scene, and there's all kinds of supernatural thrillers and weird detective stories and science fiction and all kinds of things happening. And that's happening in every one of India's 22 official and a couple hundred unofficial languages. So we were interested in trying to explore that. But I grew up knowing virtually nothing about caste. And even after living in India for a long time, I didn't understand very much. But we understood that there was not a lot of imaginative writing, speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy being published that was written by authors who weren't Brahmin or who weren't very high caste people. And so when Ria came on, we started talking about that. Here's a person who's done this Ambedkarite podcast, this brilliant content, and is really involved in caste issues and is also a science fiction and fantasy fan. So what can we put together, right? And I got turned on to a lot of this stuff. I think one of the first anthologies that I read was Year's Best SF 9. That was my first exposure to Octavia Butler. And it had a story from this anthology called Cosmos Latinos, which is a collection of Latin American science fiction. And then there were these Lightspeed anthologies like Queers Destroy Science Fiction and People of Color Destroy Science Fiction. And so along the lines of that, R and I started putting together a list of potential authors who could be in a book.
That's amazing. It's really interesting to hear how this idea developed purely out of conversations that you were having.
I think R was very different from any intern who had applied to us. So we were both very excited to get to work with them. And when Rakesh told me that this was one of the things that they had thought about, it made me stop and think, oh yeah, who are we reading other than white dudes or books from the global north? And the few Indian sci-fi writers that I had read had a certain voice to it, and there was nothing that was representative of the rest of the country, of say someone in the Northeast or someone from Gujarat or someone from Maharashtra. And I think that was the most interesting thing. Okay, let's make a call for this. Let's see where this goes. The whole process has been really, really exciting. And I just hope this encourages more people to look for different voices in this genre, and also people who've got stuff that they've not put out into the world because they're like, who's going to read my weird story?
We had a launch event for the book here in London, and they sold out of all the books that we sent, and they're asking for another order. You think that, okay, it's so far away and these stories are so India referential, you know?
Yeah.
Like, why do people care about it like outside of India? But the thing is, I feel like when you have Indian writing in English, especially in a lot of, let's say, upper caste writers, right? In the attempt to be more global, it ends up just sounding really corny, because things that really read as the most universal are when it's really specific. The more hyper-local you go, the more true you are to yourself. And not necessarily personal narratives. I'm saying in like fiction or in music or just in art, that's what's really universal. So that's what I feel the appeal is, because I think there is this temptation otherwise for people, let's say, even if you take caste out of it, or people who have had maybe more cosmopolitan backgrounds or exposure to try and, I guess, copy what they see. But to be very frank, how can the Indian version of something like compete with the original thing? You have to make your own thing, and that's what I think this book is. And I think that's why it's having this kind of response. And I think that should be the takeaway for other artists and writers and editors.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the more refreshing things about this is, one, there were a lot of writers I didn't recognize and whose work I desperately want to read more of. And the other is that it was so expansive. There was so much room for weirdness as Rashmi said. And I really enjoyed that because I do feel a lot of people have a generalized point of view about sci-fi. There are some tropes that people tend to follow. There are some perspectives. And usually with any kind of storytelling, there is challenge, there is conflict, there is the idea of social hierarchy, which is quite common in a lot of sci-fi literature. But given that caste is such a big part of Indian society, it is shocking that it hasn't appeared in more fantasy and sci-fi literatures written by people from marginalized castes. So I do really love that this is a space for that. I also wanted to ask, how did the anthology come together on a very basic level? Did you seek out these stories? Did you commission people? Was there an open call? What was the nitty-gritty of it?
Basically, we did all the things that you just mentioned. But I will say, just because I think that's what's different about it, is that we operated from the beginning with this deduction, not even belief, that there had to have been stories written in other languages that would be speculative fiction. And they might not have understood themselves in that sense, genre-wise, or other people might not have included them in other anthologies. But we knew that they had to have existed. So we started out looking for these perspective stories and authors. If a person has written something that's maybe an urban folktale, maybe they've written something about robots. Rakesh can speak more about the process of that. I think he had a lot of great adventures hunting these people down. I did a lot of the new commissions. There's a lot of my friends who are in the book who have seen the liberatory potential or more the imaginative kind of potential of speculative fiction, like ideas and aesthetics and that whole kind of language. But most of them are visual artists or gallery artists. So it was a matter of convincing them to get into print, really. So some of the stories that have been included are like comic narratives and visual novels. Some of them are people like Nabi Haider Ali, who primarily does illustration, especially for children's books. But he sent in a story. I don't think we were expecting him to write a prose story, and it's really amazing. Hamida Khan also, she's a friend of mine. I knew her from my reporting days, and so obviously I've read her nonfiction stuff. She had such a great voice. And she wrote a little flash fiction about a sapphic Tamil mermaid story for a friend's website. And I was like, you need to write me a story for my anthology. So it was a lot of seeing the potential in people on the newer commissions. But I think it's the mixture of all of these methods that really made it what it is. And I think also when people want to work with artists from marginalized communities or do any kind of new initiative like that, they want to do what they've always done and sprinkle on some diversity and representation. And that's why other efforts will end up being quite shallow. Because if you want to try to do something really different, there's so many things that you need to account for in terms of extra support that authors might need. They might not be familiar with how things are done institutionally and how do you set them up for success in those kinds of systems. You can't just do your job how you've always done it and then expect the product to be totally different. So I think it was that kind of mixture that really enabled something like this. I would say the behind the scenes of it was quite unglamorous in terms of chasing people down and emailing and loads of copy editing.
I think people will be really surprised to realize how unglamorous publishing can be.
Absolutely.
It was really fun. So ARC had this list of people that they were pretty sure they wanted to commission work from or they thought could write for the book. And then we were brainstorming well-known Dalit writers that hadn't written speculative fiction before but might be interested in giving it a go. Through that, we got a story from Bama and a story from Gogu Shamla, which I'm super kicked that they're in the book. We were looking for writers in other languages who had worked in speculative fiction before and hadn't been translated. And we found Gautami Putra Kambli's work in Marathi, which is this very philosophical, mythological, epic piece. And we had to find a translator who was willing to tackle it, and Cyrus did a great job. And some just came to us, like this translator, Rohit, who translates from Telugu, found us this story, The Last Radio Play by V. Chandrasekhar Rao, who's a writer that's no more, but he had done some pretty experimental stuff in Telugu. And then we found P.A. Uttaman's work in Malayalam. So some of it came to us, some of it we hunted down. And then we did do an open call also. In conversation with R and Priyanka Paul early on in the process, they were very clear that they didn't want it to be exclusive to Dalit writers or to Dalit Bahujan writers. Anybody could be in the book. So we did do an open call and we got about 25 or 30 submissions. Maybe it was more than that. Anyway, we ended up including 7 stories from the open call. And a few of those writers are from marginalized communities and a few of them aren't. But some of them are first-time writers and some of them are people who'd been published before, but they're all amazing additions to the book, I think.
They absolutely are. I recognize a few really wonderful writers like Archita Mitra, and you mentioned Hamida Khan. I loved her short story. It's really exciting to see the mix of people you've brought together for this.
I think we also really wanted it to have that mix of contexts and languages and ages. I think when people have, in some places like media and culture, have started thinking about the caste question, I can honestly say it's been from a very tokenistic point of view. So it's either let's just suddenly pull up people who've been there for ages, but now suddenly we remember Bama and Meena Gandasamy and all these people, let's remember they exist. Or let's go for absolutely only the most new people who are also conversant in the language that's already dominant. And like never the twain shall meet, basically. We wanted to have a book that has something for everybody because we all are really big anthology readers. So we were also just thinking about what would be a really fun and enjoyable anthology to make. If they're all good and they're all tonally the same, and they all have the same concerns, that doesn't make it a great anthology.
I think the danger of the one kind of story is something that's underestimated in the publishing industry because there is a sort of oversaturation of certain kinds of writing. And this is definitely very different from that. I'm sure this wasn't an easy endeavor. I know that you guys had immense support in terms of the Kickstarter campaign. I wanted to know what kind of challenges you guys faced putting this together.
I think the biggest challenge has been after printing the book, actually having the books and making sure all the copies actually get into the reader's hand. I think we could write a speculative fiction story about that.
We got hit by a bunch of new customs regulations, so there are still some people in Canada who haven't got their books yet. Yeah, we're working on it. That part has definitely been the most difficult.
Oh God, customs regulations. The real world seeping into the dystopian.
Yeah.
But I think that ties back also to the unglamorous parts of publishing. This is definitely one of them.
Chasing after people's drafts.
Yes, chasing after drafts. We had to be persistent. And R was excellently persistent with lots of people.
You have all my empathy. I feel like half my life is spent circling back, just following up on this.
Right.
I think I had the pleasure and the challenge of working with a lot of my friends. So I would have email threads which are like circling back, and then the text message just like, would you please just send it right now? So had a lot of that going on. But it was fun. And I also think since I'm just starting out in the publishing world, it really made me realize that when you're trying to get into publishing, the job that everybody wants is being an editorial assistant and like being in there with the narrative edits and developing the story. And that's the one that they make movies about. But I discovered that I really like being more on the people side and the commissioning and the production. I really enjoyed that more. That opened my eyes to the different roles that are available in publishing also. So I think I really value that knowledge.
I think the first book you sent to print is a roller coaster of roles and emotions and everything. So yeah, I can imagine that it was a pretty formative experience.
Well, it's not precisely the first book I've done. I've done a few others because I have worked in publishing before, but I was doing only editorial stuff. So this was the one where I got to do more commissioning and production stuff.
I can imagine that you guys had to take on a lot of different roles in the making of this. Also, you very deliberately went out looking for stories written in regional Indian languages. And Rakesh, Rashmi, you've had some history working with anthologies and translated fiction. Was it easier because you had that experience and were you tapping into known networks in terms of translators and things like that? Or was this a whole new take?
A lot of the translators are people that we hadn't worked with before, but how one works with a translator, we've had a fair amount of experience with that now. a couple of people we've worked with before, like Nirmal Rajagopalan, who translated Tamil Magan's story from Tamil. He had worked on the Ayakudi murders by Indra Soundarajan before. And we'd worked with Meena Kandasamy before, not as a translator, but she had a comic in one of our anthologies a while back. We have done a bunch of anthologies at this point, translations from Tamil and from Urdu and from Hausa, Nigerian language, and from Gujarati. So we have had a fair amount of experience working with translators, trying to get a language which is equally comfortable for an Indian English reader and an American or British English reader.
So this is an anthology which is obviously filled with amazing stories. Rashmi is among them. But amongst all of this, there have to be some that stood out to you personally. Could you tell us a bit about that? Which ones were your favorites?
I really liked Kunal's Santanam Gaming. I think that was one of the first people that I got on board. And so it made it much more real. It's a great story. And I think even for Kunal, he's done a lot of printed his own zines and comics. So for him being in a book, I think that was a big deal. I think being part of that journey, and he's one of my best friends. So that was great. Definitely Hamida's was wonderful. We've never met in person, but getting to work with her like this was really good because when we started out as reporters, we would critique each other's writing every week for 3 years straight. So being in this writing world together again, that was also really lovely. And her story is fantastic. It's really one of my favorites. Who else? I really love the concepts and ideas and stuff in Rahis. We have so many stories that are genuinely scary and disturbing to read, like Yukti's The Blob. I think the first time when I read the draft, I really felt nauseous. It was that good.
There was one that you didn't want to read, right? This house is never clean.
That scared me. That really scared me. I didn't like it at all. It's a great story, but it was so scary. I don't know if you've read, they call it creepypastas.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, when I was 11 or 12, people would send them to each other to scare each other in school. And this gave me that feeling. I was like, I hate it. And that's how I know it's good because I'm feeling so disturbed. Actually, I'm really surprised that there was so much horror. That's something that I wasn't expecting as much of. I love Bama's story and also Gogu Shamala's. I think being up close to see how Rakesh and the translator and Gogu Shamala herself, seeing how that story developed was a really great learning experience for me.
That one was difficult to edit.
Yeah, it was difficult.
There's just a ton of very specific cultural stuff in it. So to try to bring that without having 50 footnotes on every page was kind of a challenge. But it turned out as a great thing to have in the anthology, especially for foreign readers, because it lays out some of the background about the Varna system and Manusmriti and stuff that the foreign readers aren't familiar with. So like my mom, when she read the book, she was really glad that story was in there because it gave her context.
It's a wonderful story, and I am personally supportive of all footnotes.
I also just wanted to say most of the writers who both R and Rakesh have mentioned are also people that I just was blown away by their stories. The Kitchen Glob for sure, and The House is Never Clean. And what I really liked about our anthology is that when I started reading science fiction, most of the sci-fi anthologies are purely prose. The thing that has also excited me about this anthology is that we have these really solid prose pieces, but we also have a comic. We have Margin Mag, which has the 1980s grungy zine feel to it. Sanatan Gaming is also a very visual piece, which has this kind of like a manual feel to it. So I think even with the different graphic narratives that we have, there's so much variety, and I'm happy about that as well. And Sumit's Space Wali, which is a comic, and Loli Cooley, which again has sequential art. So I think that's also another really interesting aspect of the anthology, that it's not only got prose narratives, but also narratives in these different graphic and sequential art forms.
I really enjoyed that, and I especially enjoyed the zine feel of it. And I wanted to ask about that. Was that something that you went out looking for? Did you set out to have a graphic narrative in the anthology?
I think that was part of the plan from the very beginning. in the first list that R and I sent to each other about people that could be in the book. R was thinking of including Kunal right away, and I was thinking of having Sumit contribute something. Sumit Kumar runs Buckermax, which is this really interesting publishing house that's done a bunch of graphic novels, including this book on the Naxalite movement, which is great. I don't know, for me, it's really hard to choose favorites, but one of the ones that came from the open call that I really like is Aswati K. Raja's story, In the Extreme Silence of the Agrahara. It's kind of based on family history, and she was talking about how her grandfather was actually sold into slavery as a little kid, and it's drawing on that in this history of Kerala, where he was sold to the Zamin, and it's this kind of magical realist thing where she's walking through an Agrahara at night. That story totally blew me away. That it came from such a young person through the open call is really a big surprise. And working on Bama's story, like with Meena Kandasamy, was super exciting. Plus, I like ghosts, right? I like ghost folklore. So Bama's story is about these weird invisible ghosts that are really hungry. And she's got this incredible description of this guy who's keeping these tiny invisible pet ghosts who just eat all the time. And he has to keep throwing food into the air, and he'll throw up a fish and just the skeleton of the fish will come down. He'll throw up fruit and only the pits will come down. I love her description of the ghost. So those are some of my favorites.
I love Tamil Magan's story also.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorites too.
It's so short and so disturbing.
This is about a kind of maybe genetically modified agricultural laborer. Yeah, we had translated that actually quite a long time ago, thinking of maybe putting it in one of the Tamil pulp anthologies, but it didn't quite seem like a pulp story.
You mentioned earlier, you didn't expect so many horror stories, but at the same time, it felt oddly natural, especially when discussing something like caste. I read Yukti's piece and I wanted to step away immediately from that. And I think This House Is Never Clean as well gave me the same feeling. It is creeping under your skin. Maybe that's not the best description or the most exciting for people listening to it. You should read it, however. But were you looking for kind of intersectional themes like that?
So I'm going to go a little bit academic for this one. The way that people understand race, right? Not just how race actually operates, but how people understand how racialization works. People sort of know, okay, it impacts avenues of life in these ways. Even people who are maybe privileged in that dynamic, you know that this is going to be like a sensitive thing. The thing with caste is that it is not really understood, even within India, the ways in which it impacts people's lives. So communicating what the experience of caste is also really tough, because even a lot of like Dalit scholars and writers and oppressed caste people themselves also fall into this trap where in trying to communicate it, have all of the markers and the similarities and the analogies linked to things that are commonly known like race and gender. But the thing about caste is that it's its own thing. It's its own subjective experience, and it's so diverse, and it's not just in India, it is across the South Asian subcontinent, and it's even in places where you wouldn't expect because of the waves of migration and the diasporas before colonialism, like the Kuli diaspora, as well as like modern sort of immigration patterns. So it really is this global phenomenon that we don't really understand. So the thing is that when you talk to people about it, people think that it's something that's always affecting you in this particular way. But it's way more subtle. And obviously it's not affecting people all the time. Like, I am not at all surprised that there's so many climate tinged stories, right? That is really natural if you think about what it means to be indigenous or Adivasi in this current Adani-Ambani nexus, right? It'll obviously come up. There's also like obviously stuff about complicated relationships. If you look at Gogo Shamala's story, which explains caste and everything, but the crux of the story is a romantic relationship and a friendship. It's a very interpersonal story. And no one is really a bad guy in that story. The person whose perspective it's from and the people that it's most like negatively experiencing are not even like the Dalit characters. It's this Brahmin guy who's engaged to be married to this Brahmin girl, and her best friend is this Dalit girl, and they're all students in a university. So a lot of the stories just seem natural. The reason that I would want to do this anthology in the first place is because these are all experiences that happen to everybody and reflections that affect everyone.
I'm so glad you mentioned that story because I also enjoyed the perspective of it. It's not even the Dalit girl who's experiencing this kind of upheaval. It is this Brahmin boy who's just in contact with her very peripherally, really. I thought about that a lot because something this anthology has is a lot of really fascinating, I keep saying perspectives, but that's really what it is, which is so unusual in Indian fiction.
I think what I like also about the anthology is that it's very true to the conversations people who are religious minorities or Adivasi or Dalit, for that matter, have with each other. If you're hanging out in a space with your friends, you're not going to be talking about caste then. Caste is really the preoccupation of upper caste people.
I think that's beautifully said and also very true. And as you said, it's not a natural topic of conversation amongst marginalized communities. It's something that is imposed on them, which is, I think, the perspective that's lacking in Indian literature, really. So it's wonderful that we're seeing it in this anthology. Earlier, you mentioned that you'd had some frustration with how the Indian speculative fiction landscape looked. And you didn't feel like it was representing what India really was. What do you think is missing? And what do you think could fill those gaps?
One thing that I wished we had more of in the book was far future or space stories, not space opera necessarily, but a big part of science fiction for me is just imagining what happens in other worlds and other planets. And there's a fair amount of science fiction in the book, but a lot of it's cyborgs and set on Earth and stuff. Very great stories. But that was one thing that I was hoping for, because I feel like one of the things that has frustrated R about Indian science fiction is whenever people talk about space in an Indian science fiction context, there's this kind of Hindu mythology aesthetic that goes with it, which I know R is really annoyed by, and Kunal is really annoyed by when it comes in video games. And people want to build spaceships that look like old temples and stuff like that. I would like to see more ideas about the far future from different Indian perspectives.
I always joke about the idea of having Mahabharata on a spaceship, and I think that's where a lot of Indian fiction goes.
Yeah, it's like, okay, that's done to death a little bit already, it seems like.
There are already a bunch of Mahabharata stories on spaceships. The first week that I was here in London and I went to a Waterstones, there was literally a shelf full of young adult Desi speculative romances. And they all have hot pink and orange kind of covers, like the Maharani of the something something. It's actually crazy how diasporic authors want to keep digging those tropes up in a sense. But also there have been like some really like intelligent plays on that, like the movie Polite Society.
I've seen it and I love it.
Yeah,
I love that.
That one's fun. And see the way that it uses this whole thing about marriage and genetic testing and cloning. There's a paper there and there's a caste narrative that's very smartly done. And I'm just wondering why there's not more takes like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of other epics, right? It seems like somehow the Mahabharata and Ramayana sort of took over Indian speculative fiction, and everybody wants to do versions of those. But there's a lot of other old stories that you can mine and change and do adaptations of, especially all the Adivasi mythology, right? Esther's story in the book, which draws on the Kasi legend of Utlain, is one of my favorites. So there's all these other stories you can do stuff with. And somehow it seems like people are stuck with endless speculative versions of the Ramayana.
The minute R said pink and orange cover, I had this very clear mental picture and I was like, oh no, I know what you're talking about.
I feel it's not just in the speculative fiction, and I've seen it actually more here than I have in Indian bookshelves back home, which is also interesting to me because I don't see a lot of these writers in the Indian writing sections in bookstores in India, but I've seen like a whole slew. I haven't checked if they're all diasporic writers or if they are writers based in India, but even in the Indian writing sections, there is this certain look to the book covers, and there are these keywords in the blurbs. Deepa has left her job and she's retracing her roots and she's connecting with her past. And the cover is either very bright with a paisley sari border watermark, and it's always yellow, pink.
Or somebody's getting left behind somewhere on their summer vacation. And then adventures happen. Nothing ever happened to me in my summer vacations. We just had like power cuts, And once I watched the Matrix trilogy 4 times in a row.
I love that we're all really let down by summer vacations. We were given to understand that it would be a time of great adventure and it turns out to just be very mundane.
Yeah.
Enid Blyton sold you a lie.
I never found out that I was the inheritor of a generational superpower or some kind of buried kingdom.
Finding a diary of an ancient relative which sets you on a journey of self-discovery. And it's got a diary, a sari, or some other antique brass item.
I was thinking mysterious letter. But yeah, I think diary and sari are two very key elements to the whole thing. So before we sign off, I have one last question. Are you working on anything currently, or is there anything in the pipeline that you want to shout out?
We have been threatening to bring out a collection of weird and horror short stories called Bandygoat. It's taking a little longer to go to print than we had hoped, but it should be out in a few months. That has stories by Kuruli Monicavale and Miriam and Rashmi and several other authors, including Lungming Lepcha from Sikkim, who's got a horror story based on Lepcha mythology, which includes my favorite demons in Indian folklore. So I'm really excited about that book. We're also bringing out 2 books by authors in the Anti-Caste SF Anthology, which were promised as part of our crowdfunding campaign. That's Parivrajak by Gautami Putra Kamble. We put one of the 4 stories in that book in the anthology, but we're going to bring out all 4 stories in translation from Marathi by Cyrus J. Libero, and one other collection of short stories by P.A. Uttaman in translation by Mritala Makuni. So those are all coming out this year, and hopefully some other things too.
Working on my master's degree has nothing much to do with publishing or with speculative fiction, but I think we're also just trying to do more things with the authors and with the ideas of the book. So we're just trying to figure out ways of keeping the conversation going. And so I think just keep an eye out on Blaft's page and my page for like events and workshops and things, because I feel like what we did and the people that we got together, I think it's really extraordinary. And I definitely don't want it to be a one-time, one-project thing. I really want to do a book club or a discussion set of questions. So anyone wants to work on that, feel free to reach out, because I really think it's something that's so much fun and there's so much in it there for everybody.
If you had a book club, I would join immediately. So, keep that in mind.
Another thing that we would really like to bring out is Kumari's in Space, which is a follow-up to our picture book, Kumari Loves a Monster, which I did in collaboration with the amazing artist Sham. So we're hoping to get a Kickstarter campaign going for Kumari's in Space so that we could also reprint Kumari Loves a Monster. And initially, this had been a trilogy. So it was Kumari Loves a Monster, Kumari's in Space, and Kumari Action Hero. And the main thing was South Indian women subverting all these tropes in these different worlds. I worked in the Tamil film industry, and it's a very hero-centric, very hero-led industry. And Kumari Action Hero was about subverting those tropes and having women rush in these high-octane situations, and they are the ones saving the children and saving the dudes from a burning petrol tanker that's crashed into a multiplex, like all these crazy situations. Yeah,
I can talk about a couple more things.
Go for it, Rakesh. Go for it.
So we're going to try to bring out a book of signage, Indian signage and typography, which is compiled by Pooja Saxena, who runs a thing called Matra Type. So she's spent her whole career just traveling around the country and working with sign makers and typographers and calligraphers. That's going to be a super fun coffee table type book. And we're also hoping to do a book of Bagriboli folklore. That community is often called Nadikurvas. In Tamil Nadu, people sometimes in English refer to them as gypsies, and they refer to themselves that way. I know that's a very offensive word in other parts of the world, but Nadikurva means the jackal people. Their own word for their own language is Bagriboli, which is related to Gujarati. So they're like an ST community from Tamil Nadu that has really amazing folklore. So we're hoping to do a book of those. And hopefully we're going to do a bilingual English and Tamil version. And the Tamil version, we're going to be working with Neelam Books in Egmore. So I'm super excited about that project.
That sounds amazing. I am a big fan of Pooja Saxena's and I love her stuff. So I'm thrilled that you're doing a book with her. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. It's been such a pleasure. I've loved hearing about your work and what went into creating this whole collection. And I really can't wait to see what comes out next. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anjali.
Thanks so much, Anjali.
Arcs is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and notes.